I used to go hiking in the mornings quite a bit, and I would mention to her, yeah, I'm going down to the mornings, and all I thought about was footwear and water. When Daniela went for a hike growing up, you thought about bears, because bears are part of the culture. They're something that's going on, but for you and I, we're never even going to think about bears because it's not part of our culture. Unless you understand the culture and setting that the story takes place, you're going to have a limited understanding of what's actually going on. The book of Ruth is quite a small book. It's only 4 short chapters, and at first glance it doesn't really seem to be too consequential of a story. We usually think of it as as a nice short romance in the middle of the more important, bigger books that are around it. And it is a lovely story. It's a beautiful widow meets Mr. Right when she thought that would you never find love again kind of story. Or else maybe it's a rags to riches story like Cinderella. Or else made in Manhattan. And when you look at the context, however, of the story, when you look at the context of when it occurs, it becomes a different story. It's a story of sin. It's a story of failure. But it's also a story of mercy and grace. Ruth draws a lot from the Jewish law that's given in Exodus, Leviticus, and in Deuteronomy. So to get the full picture of what's going on, we have to understand the culture and the context that the story takes place in. The book of Ruth opens by telling us that it takes place during the time of the judges. We don't know exactly when it occurs, but by comparing various names and family trees, we can place it just after Joshua, right at the beginning of the book of Judges and a few generations ahead of the book of 1 Samuel. In the context of what has just happened historically, God's chosen people finally have a home. God has led them out of the wilderness. He's given them their own nation. He's given them laws with which to govern this nation. They are unique among the other kingdoms in the region in that they are set apart for God. They're under His protection and His blessing. And He has given them this promise in Deuteronomy chapter 28. Where God promised, if you faithfully obey the voice of the Lord your God, being careful to do all His commandments that I command you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations of the earth. And all these blessings shall come upon you and overtake you. If you obey the voice of the Lord your God, blessed shall you be in the city, and blessed shall you be in the field. It's sad to see then that the book of Ruth starts off by saying that the land had just been hit by a famine. God had previously warned the Israelites that He would send famine if they left Him or if they left His law. So we can assume that the people so early on are already falling away from His law. We made a character at the beginning of the book of Ruth called Elimelech, who is from the town of Bethlehem. And in this famine, he takes his wife Naomi and his sons Mahlon and Achilion, and he takes them out of Judah and into Moab, which was an enemy country, despite being a first-generation settler of the Promised Land. Now, in doing so, Elimelech openly rejects God's promises, and he removes his wife and sons from God's promises as well, and from God's Promised Land. He found wives from Moab for his sons, again in direct disobedience to God's very specific instructions in His law. And he seems content to spend the rest of his life living in Moab, and for his sons to do the same. This story starts off with disobedience, with sin, and it then continues with tragedy when Elimelech dies, and then his sons die, leaving Naomi a widow with her 2 daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah, who are now also widows. Elimelech leaves a legacy of disobedience, rejection of God's law, and failure. To fully grasp the seriousness of Ruth and Naomi and Orpah's situation, we need to remember when this happened. A widow without sons has no way of providing for herself. A woman in this time and culture is provided for either by her father, who will want to get her married off as soon as possible, and then by her husband, who will want to leave her with a few children, and then finally her sons. Naomi is now alone, so upon hearing that the famine has ended in Judah, she decides to return to the Promised Land. She tells Ruth and Orpah to remain in Moab, stating that she's unable to provide more sons for them, and then she tells them to return to their parents. Orpah follows her advice. Ruth, however, has clearly grown to love Naomi, and so now, in an incredible act of sacrifice, she commits herself to be Naomi's carer. So let's read our first wee passage tonight, Ruth chapter 1 and verse 16. Naomi has just told Ruth to return and to follow Orpah back to Moab. But Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. So they returned back to Judah, and back to the town of Bethlehem. And this is where our story begins. A land that has spent the last generation in disobedience and in lawless carelessness. A people who in only one generation have drifted away from the unique and the holy calling that God had placed upon them. A family that has chosen material comfort over God's law. And a woman who, despite a clear belief in this God, now lives solely to care for her aging mother-in-law, living in complete poverty and in helplessness, far away from her home, among people who would consider her a foreigner and an enemy, with no security and with no provision and with no livelihood. So firstly, it's important for us to remember that Moab was an historical enemy of God's people. You can read more about that in the book of Numbers, but it's enough for us to know tonight that as a Moabite living in Judah, Ruth would have been very unwelcome. We could sometimes look at the story and think of it maybe just as a case of someone being far away from home, making a fresh start. But when we look at the law that God has previously given, we get a better picture. Where God had said, no Ammonite or Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord. Even to the 10th generation, none of them may enter the assembly of the Lord forever. So this isn't just a geographical issue. God's law specifically prohibited Moabites from worshipping with Jews. That same passage that we've just read goes on to outline the different levels of separation that the Israelites were meant to keep from different nations. There's different levels for the Egyptians and for the Edomites. And Moabites are at the most severe level of separation. God, not the Israelites, has passed judgment on Moab and its people. This really shows the level of Elimelech's failure in bringing his family there. And for Ruth to now journey back was to consign herself to separation from her neighbours. She isn't entering a new life of promise and potential romance. She's accepting a life as Naomi's carer in solitude and probably loneliness. Ruth begins her life in Israel rejected by God's law, outside of his promise and of his blessings. So what's a single foreign woman without friends or relatives to do in this scenario? There's only one thing that she can do, and Ruth gets right to it. Let's look down into chapter 2 and verse 1. Ruth chapter 2 and verse 1. Now, Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem. And he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers.' So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest." So Ruth and Naomi arrived in Bethlehem at the time of the barley harvest. Now, with any harvest, there's the opportunity to glean. So what is gleaning? What's going on here? So again, let's take a look back at the law. I'm in Deuteronomy chapter 24, where God had given this law. "When you reap your harvest in the field and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat your olive trees, you shall not go over them again. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow. When you gather the grapes of the vineyard, you shall not strip it afterwards. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore, I command you to do this." God, in his mercy, had provided a means that anyone could find food if they needed it. If any part of the harvest was missed, it was to be left for those in need. And God had stated it was for the widows and for the fatherless, i.e., those without a man in the family who would otherwise be working in the harvest. This was a law designed to provide for those who couldn't provide for themselves. And, just in case someone told Ruth that this is for true blue Israelites only, and not for foreigners or for refugees, God specifically included sojourners, or the word means foreigners, in that list. Now, just to put that in context, I want you to think about our harvest here. As some of you know, I grew up on a farm, and we didn't grow barley or wheat. Our harvest was silage. Every year, Dad puts fertilizer on the fields that he's planning to bale. He keeps the cows off those fields and let the grass grow. Then, if there's been enough time without rain, and the fields are going to be dry enough to take a tractor on them, and the grass is long enough, he checks the weather forecast, he taps the barometer a few times, and he calls the contractors to come out and to bale the fields. First, they mow the grass into lines. Then they put the baler over it and they lift it into bales. Then they put the wrapper over it, and that wraps it in the silage wrapping. And then Dad will come out and will take the bales in one by one and will store them for the winter. Now, at any stage, if a contractor missed half a field, or if they baled some but then didn't wrap them, or if they had wrapped them and then Dad went to take them in but then left half of them in the field, at any point, do you think that he would just put this up to, "Oh well, you win some, you lose some"? No, he'd be immediately out to go and make sure that what was left was picked up, that what he'd missed was brought in. It wouldn't just be left there for anyone to come and get it. The law of gleaning was absolutely revolutionary in the time. It would be revolutionary now. To ask a farmer to simply let people take parts of the harvest they had laboured over would have made no financial sense to them at all. It was purely an act of grace, a law that God put in place to provide for the poor. We see an important aspect of God's character here. God cares for the poor. God cares for the widows. God cares for the fatherless. He cares for the refugee, for the immigrant, for the misplaced. He cares for those who are helpless, who are lonely, who would be otherwise forgotten by society. We read in the book of Proverbs where God says, "Do not rob the poor because he is poor, or crush the afflicted at the gate, for the Lord will plead their cause." Not only that, but he expects his people to share that concern. We're not just to pray for those in need, we are to give financially, materially, and generously. As we see, Ruth goes gleaning in the fields of a man named Boaz, who is a relative of her late husband. As a young single woman, she would have been vulnerable to insults, to abuse, or even worse. In fact, Naomi even says later, in verse 22, that Ruth was lucky that she wasn't assaulted. She definitely received her fair share of prejudice. Look at the way that Boaz's servant described her. She's the young Moabite woman back from Moab, just in case Boaz missed it the first time. How does Boaz respond? Let's look on in chapter 2 and verse 8. Ruth chapter 2, verse 8. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping, and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favour in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Then she said, "I have found favour in your eyes, my lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants." And at mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some bread, and dip your morsel in the wine." So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain, and she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. When she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also pull out some of the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her." Does Boaz send her back to where she came from? Does he tell her to go and find a Moabite's field to glean? Does he say that he doesn't mind Moabites as long as they keep to themselves? No, he welcomes her. He tells her where to find food and drink. He invites her to have lunch with the other workers. He tells her to stay close to the other young women. He specifically tells the young men to leave her alone. He gives out of his own harvest to ensure that she has enough for herself. He provides for her, and in a way that makes her feel comfortable and safe. Boaz obeys the law of gleaning, but more than that, he understands the spirit of the law. He isn't given reluctantly. He is happy to follow God's law. He has God's own heart in this. Boaz goes above and beyond what the law actually required here. Boaz demonstrates grace, giving that which is undeserved. Ruth has been rejected by the law, but now she has been restored by grace. And thirdly, we see how she is redeemed by love. Let us look on in chapter 2, down into verse 20. Ruth chapter 2 and verse 20. "And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, May he," that is Boaz, "be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "This man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers." Now we're going to look at what that word means in a second. It's one of those words maybe that we just take for granted, that we see it in the Bible. But let's look on down then into chapter 4 and verse 1. Just to give a bit of context as to what happens in the passage in between. Ruth goes to Boaz. She asks Boaz to redeem her. Again, we'll see what this means. Boaz says he will. He essentially proposes to her. But there is one snag in that the way that the law of redemption works, there is one other person who has got priority here. Again, I will look at this briefly. So, Ruth chapter 4 and verse 1. "Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there. And behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, 'Turn aside, friend, sit down here.' And he turned aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, 'Sit down here.' So they sat down. Then he said to the Redeemer, 'Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of these sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me, that I may know, for there is no one beside you to redeem it, and I come after you.' And he said, 'I will redeem it.' Then Boaz said, 'The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead of his inheritance.' Then the Redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. Now, this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, buy it for yourself, he drew off his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, you are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and to Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day. So again, to understand what's going on here, we need to be aware of three specific laws that God had ordained for the Israelites. Now, these aren't religious laws, and they aren't moral laws. These are societal laws. And these are laws that were there to provide to provide for and to protect the weakest members of the community. So the first law, protection for the poor. In the book of Leviticus, God left out a law called redemption. If a man lost his property, he had the first legal right of buying it back, i.e., of redeeming it. Now, this law gave legal claim to the poor. It didn't give automatic renewal. And this law essentially prevented the rich from taking advantage of the poor. No matter who you were, if you had lost your land and property due to poverty or due to hardship, as soon as you could afford it back, you got it back. This law also placed a requirement to provide financial assistance to your family. If you couldn't afford to buy your land back, your closest relative could do it on your behalf. So there was protection for the poor. Then there was a provision for the poor. If a man lost his property and he couldn't redeem it, he could wait until the year of Jubilee, which is a year that happened every 50 years, and your land would be restored to you. Now, it wasn't just land that was restored. All debts were cancelled. All slaves were freed. There was no cost involved. The land would be restored to you. Again, this was an economic safety net that God put in place. It prevents the rich from buying out the poor. On that 50th year, land was restored to the original family lines. It prevented monopolies. It prevented huge differences between rich and poor. And finally, then, there was protection and provision for women. In Deuteronomy chapter 25, we read this law: if a widow was left childless, the late husband's next kinsman must provide her with children. Now, this seems strange in the 21st century. Tim actually briefly touched on it this morning. It was something which we read about in the story of Judah. You need to remember that in the time that this law was given, a woman was completely dependent upon her father, her husband, or her sons to provide for her. So, if a woman was left childless and a widow, God put into place a law where she would be provided with children who would then be able to take care of her and to continue her late husband's line. And God took this law very seriously, as we saw this morning. In Genesis chapter 38, we read that Tamar's husband died, but his brother didn't want to give her children, and so God slew him as a result of his disobedience. This was not a law put in place for matchmaking or for encouraging relationships. This was a divine law for the provision and protection of women who would otherwise be ignored by society. Now, growing up, we in my family played a lot of board games. We played a lot of card games, etc. And we still do whenever we get together. Now, one of the staples would be Uno. It's a favourite game for many families. I'm sure most of you here have played it. One of the reasons Uno was so popular is because although the rules are very simple, there's lots of scope for modifying them or for adapting them. Almost every family has their own variation of Uno, also called house rules. So in my family, the house rules are, there's the stupid card rule, which is if you pick up a card when you weren't meant to, or the wrong card, or you put one down you shouldn't, you have to pick up an extra card for being stupid. Also, another rule we have that is, if someone puts down a 5, everyone has to slam their hand down, and the last person has to pick up 5 cards. Now, if I go to your house and we play Uno, and I was to slam my hand down on the deck every time there's a 5, or I was to insist that you have to pick up a stupid card, I'm not going to get very far, because these aren't the actual rules. These are our own modifications, our own version of the rules made for us, for what suits us. They're not the official rules. They're our customized version. By Ruth's time, it seems that the Israelites had tweaked, modified, and watered down the laws that God had given to suit themselves. They had their own house rules, essentially. In some cases, they were ignoring them entirely, basically treating God's law like it was a card game. For example, God gave a law that every 7 years the land was remain unfarmed, so that soil could recover. We find out later in the Bible that they never actually kept the Sabbath year. They took God's law and they made it optional. Here we find that God gave a law for the protection of the weak and of the helpless in society. And the Israelites chopped a few bits out and they combined what remained into a law where, from reading Ruth, it basically appears that the law now was that the nearest kinsman could redeem a relative's land for himself as long as he was willing to also provide heirs for the relative's widow. In other words, one part of God's law was twisted into something optional, another's law was twisted into something self-beneficial. Even the actual punishment for breaking the law had been watered down. The original law said that if a man wouldn't provide the widow with children, the widow was to take off his sandal and was to spit in his face as a sign of his sin. By Ruth's time, we can see all that happened was that you took off your own sandal, and everyone went, okay, he's taken off his sandal. God's law was seen as optional. The spirit of the law had been lost. I don't know how many people here have actually read through Leviticus. I'm going to assume actually not many. It took me years to get around to reading it. And you might think that it's all the boring ceremonial stuff, and maybe it doesn't really apply today, or it's all just rules and regulations that we don't really have to worry about in the 21st century. But if you read them in the context in which they were given, however, if you think about why they were given, when they were given, and to whom, they actually start to make a lot of sense. For example, in Leviticus 12, it gives lots of rules about the fact that mothers who have just given birth, all the different rules for being clean, things they can touch and can't touch. These might seem weird and largely unnecessary, until you remember that there was basically no medical hygiene at that time, and that these are over 1 million people walking through the desert in tents, and you realize that this law probably prevented a lot of postpartum infections. Leviticus 13 has rules about how those with infectious diseases are to stay separate and isolated from others. And then chapter 14 has all the tests you were to do before someone could rejoin society, and that does sound quite familiar now, doesn't it, in the last few years. They may seem restrictive, but when you remember who they were given to and why, they make a lot of sense. There's laws about animal husbandry. There's laws about food preparation. There's laws about washing clothes. There's laws about dishonest business practices. All laws that, when you look at them, you go, okay, well, that's a bit of a weird law, it's a bit restrictive. When you look at why they were given and to whom, you realize that they were revolutionary and very necessary. By the way, on a complete side note, when I was reading through Leviticus 13 and the part about infectious diseases, I found an isolated verse in verse 40 states that if a man goes bald, he can still be considered clean. This has nothing to do with the message tonight. I just think it's a very good verse to be aware of. Many of these laws are about ritual and ceremonial cleanliness, showing the Israelites that they were to be separated, consecrated, holy. But they also make a lot of practical sense for a people wandering in large numbers in tents, for people seeking to build a new nation, for a society where justice, equality, and the worth of the individual are something very close to the heart of God. God doesn't make laws for the sake of it. He does it for his glory, yes, but also for his good. In the case of these laws regarding inheritance and of redemption, they were given to ensure that those who were disadvantaged within society, for example, women, especially widows, could still have a quality of life. God gave these laws as the original safety net. He put in place the very first benefit system for the poor, for immigrants, for the unemployed. Boaz understood this. Look, however, at how the other kinsman describes it. where he says, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. Look at how his attitude compares with Boaz. This man is concerned about his right of redemption. Boaz is thinking about his responsibility of redemption. Where he says he cannot redeem it for himself, Boaz is thinking about redeeming it for Ruth. Where his attitude is, I should, but I won't, Boaz thinks, I don't have to, but I will. And where he is worried about how fathering another son through Ruth will spoil his inheritance, Boaz, through Ruth, gets the inheritance of having the Messiah born of his line. If there's one thing you take home this evening, let it be this: be like Boaz. Boaz does everything right here. He receives Ruth with kindness. He restores Ruth with grace. He redeems Ruth with love. But before we can be like Boaz, when we compare ourselves to Christ, we're much more like Ruth. We've all fallen short of his law. We've all been found guilty. We've all been found wanting. We're separated by him just by nature of who we are. And there's nothing we can do for ourselves to overcome that separation. Like Ruth, we are all rejected by God's law. We have all sinned. We've all come short of the glory of God. And like Ruth, we've all been given grace, or we've been offered grace and goodness beyond any level we could ever ask or hope for. God, through Christ, has provided so much more for us than just material need. God has offered us through Christ salvation. He offers to bring us into his family. He can lift us from grace and from death. He can lift us from guilt and from death into forgiveness and life. Like Ruth, those of us who know Christ have been restored by grace, as we see in Ephesians chapter 2. But God, being rich in mercy because of the great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved, so that in the coming ages he might show the immeasurable riches of his grace and kindness towards us in Christ Jesus. For by grace you have been saved through faith. This is not your own doing. It is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast. And like Ruth, we are in need of redemption. Our debt of sin is too high for us to ever pay it back by ourselves. We're in spiritual poverty. Every sin we commit just increases that debt, until Christ paid the price on our behalf, taking the role of kinsman redeemer so that we, like Ruth, could be redeemed through his love. As we read in 1 Peter, you were redeemed from your empty ways of life, inherited from your ancestors, not with perishable things like silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ, like that of an unblemished and spotless lamb. Like Ruth, we are rejected by the law, but like Ruth, we can be restored by grace. We can be redeemed through the love of Christ. So for those who are in Christ, we remember that we have been saved. We praise God for his grace and love to us. If you are not in Christ tonight, this grace is available to you. This grace, this love is something which is offered to you freely through Christ. For those of us who have experienced that grace and that love, like Boaz, we demonstrate that grace and that love to others. We pray that God will give us a heart like his own, to love and to care for others. We ask for his generosity to give freely to those in need, to protect those we can protect, to encourage those we can encourage. We look at the amazing gifts that God has so freely given, and we ask for his help to give just as freely to those who need it. We're going to close now with words to that effect. I then shall live